Hello, welcome to week 6 of EDUC 749. Hope you've had a great Thanksgiving and are getting geared up for the final push of this class, but then also just finishing up a semester at school. I know this is a busy time, and we will jump in to Module 6. We're going to go over a couple of comments from the lesson plan assignment that you turned in, and I did gather that a few of you commented that this was a pretty involved lesson plan, that you of course don't have time to do something to this detail in your regular planning for your classroom. So that it made me think of this comic. However, as a couple of you highlighted, there is benefit in periodically thinking about your lessons in such a detailed way. Kelly mentioned this was the most detailed template she'd ever used, but thinking that it really did help her focus on the individual students in her class rather than just teaching to the majority. And I know when you're teaching the number of classes and lessons that you teach on a daily basis, sometimes it is hard to get to that individual student component in your planning process. But this template was really designed, as Kelly said, to help you think about accommodations and building those accommodations in to the design of your lesson, knowing that sometimes we do have to focus our lessons on the majority, thinking back to that bowling pin example at the beginning of the class. Sometimes we do that, but sometimes by thinking about the accommodations that we need and focusing on those outside pins, as she described it in Module 1, you're also creating lessons that meet the majority's needs as well. Libby also mentioned just how the lesson plan she created allowed her to think through the need for individualized attention and support at each level, meeting students where they're at. The other thing I liked about what Libby mentioned in her reflection on the lesson plan was just feeling fortunate that she's in a district that supports PLCs. And we haven't spent a whole lot of time talking about PLCs in this class, but PLCs are such an advantage when you think about how you can benefit from a structure at a district level and at a school level of teachers supporting teachers and looking at data together, talking about how to meet students' needs, talking about how to plan, looking at formative assessments, and really thinking through what do we need to do differently to meet the needs of our kids. So I'm a huge proponent of PLCs. I think they are one of the single most impactful things that we can do in education to improve students' performance. And so I liked seeing that Libby was able to make that connection between her lesson plan and seeing how important that is within her district, the value of PLCs. So in week 6, there's two topics kind of combined in week 6, and they don't fit perfectly, but in a 8-week class, it's sometimes hard to get everything fit in together. So the primary focus of this week is on disproportionality, the primary focus of what I have put in the modules. You'll read chapters in the book that are about sensory impairments, so blind and low vision, hearing impairments, other low incidence disabilities. Though you'll read 2 chapters in the textbook about those. So there is a video this week that is focused on some technology supports for those students, but most of the work that I have put in the module is really around the topic of disproportionality, because that's not addressed as significantly in your textbook. So when you think about disproportionality, there's several resources in Canvas, but I wanted to give you some background knowledge about disproportionality. So there are several different areas that you can look at when we talk about disproportionality in special education. It could be that we look at the representation of different races and ethnicities in special education. So for example, I worked in a district a few years ago that was found to be disproportionate because we had too many white students identified with autism. So when you looked at our overall demographic data, we had a higher percentage of students, of white students eligible for autism than we had white students in our overall population. So that was an area that we had to focus on, and we had to work as a special ed team to figure out what we're going to do to address that. So it could mean that there are certain racial or ethnic groups that are at greater risk for being identified for special education. In general, or that could be at a greater risk for being identified for specific disability. So another thing that you will hear about occasionally, and we have dealt with in Indiana and in several districts around the Indianapolis area, is African American students being at greater risk of being identified with an emotional disability, or being at greater risk of being identified with a cognitive disability. And so that's a significant concern when you think about our evaluation practices and our RTI practices. So their eligibility in special education can be a part of disproportionality. The other piece is to look at is there a disproportionate representation in our educational placements? So, for instance, are there more students that are African American that are in self-contained placements? Are there more students that are African American with higher discipline levels? So when I walk through an office as a central office administrator in my current role, and I see the office is full of students that are African American that are being sent to the office for discipline, that tells me we have a problem. There's an issue with disproportional representation in our discipline practices. That was something that we were found in my current school district about 5 years ago to be disproportionate in the number of suspension and expulsions for students that are African American. And so we put a big initiative behind positive behavior supports, training our staff in cultural competency. We have a pretty diverse, not as diverse as some of your communities, but we are about 70% white in my school district, but we're over 95% white in our teaching force. And so part of for us, our focus was how do we support more cultural competency among our staff, since our staff does not represent our student population. So disproportionality is a big issue, a big concern that the first thing is to be aware of it as teachers and as administrators, and then really dig into it and figure out what does that mean for us as educators. So wanted to give you that background on disproportionality. There are a few videos that'll go into that a little bit more deeply. This quote challenged me, and it's in one of the articles that you'll read that's in Canvas this week. For a field built on the principle of fairness and grounded in the rhetoric of the civil rights movement, ongoing disproportionality strongly indicates systemic problems of inequity, prejudice, and marginalization within the education system. That's big when you think about an area that can really have dramatic impact on our students. And for those of us that have made a career out of special education, to think that we still have a structure, we still have a problem in education about inequity, prejudice, and marginalization, we've got to address that. And so that's why this gets so much attention in this week's module. Here's some statistics to just kind of support. This is not from a resource that's in Canvas, but this is from an NEA, National Education Association. African American students who are viewed as having challenging behavior are referred more often for special education programs for emotional disabilities. We just talked about that. You can see some other things here about American Indian or Alaska Native children, Asian and Pacific Islander students, English language learners. I know several of you are make that a focus of your career, are more likely to receive special education services in school districts with relatively small ELL populations than in districts with large populations. Again, I think that goes to that cultural competency piece. If you don't have as many students who are ELL, then you don't know necessarily how to address them. And so sometimes special education is the go-to to solve all the problems, when really it's not a disability problem. It's a function of we need to have a more appropriate, more equitable educational experience for students that come from a diverse background. So the videos this week, there's one from Russ Skiba, who is a professor in Indiana at IU. He's one of the leading researchers in the country on disproportionality. And then also minority representation in special education and how RTI can address disproportionality. So I think those will support very well the information that I've just shared. and then also talking about the video that will reference some technology strategies for students with low incidence disabilities. One thing I'll point out in your text is it references other health impairment, OHI, as a low incidence disability. I assume this is the case in Illinois. We've seen a huge increase in Indiana in other health impairment. It's one of the fastest growing disabilities, primarily because of students with ADHD, ADD, or other health needs. So I don't really think of OHI as a low incidence disability, but they do talk about it that way in your textbook. So maybe you have a different experience, but for us, that is a disability that is really on the rise. You have a couple of assignments this week. A discussion post on disproportionality that is pretty self-explanatory. There is an assignment that's due at the end of the week where you will look at different situations, different scenarios, and you'll identify what disability you think is reflected in that scenario and some different approaches and strategies that you would recommend based on that scenario. So I'm excited to see that work from you. And then just like we've done the last couple of weeks, I'd like you, after you go through the module and get some more background on disproportionality, I'd really like you to send me just a brief email or message, and I really do mean brief, 2 sentences is perfect, of what's an aha for you from disproportionality. I really do think this is one of the most significant things that we face in the field of education, and specifically in special education. So I really do want to know what's an aha from you that maybe you didn't know before this module. So I gave you an example here that maybe you didn't know that schools are held accountable for how different races and ethnicities are disciplined through suspensions and expulsions. So if I were writing that, it might be from my classroom, I would say, I want to look at my discipline referrals, and I want to see if my classroom is made up of 80% students who are white, do my discipline referrals reflect 80% white, so that I can really get an idea of if my discipline is matching up with the overall demographics of my class. So again, really simple. Don't make it a dissertation. No citations. Just send me 2 sentences, and that would be great. Just because I'm curious how you interpret the information about disproportionality. That's it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing your work this week. Thanks.